Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Bianca Rojas Cruz and I am a provisional psychologist. So today I thought we would have a bit of a discussion on emotions and what emotions are, why we have them and why we don't necessarily want to get rid of them. So emotions can do things like bring us joy and pleasure if we perceive the emotion as being a good thing or a good emotion. Conversely, they can cause us quite a bit of distress if we have judged them as being perhaps a bad thing or being painful and something that we want to get rid of. In saying that, there's no such thing as a bad emotion because all emotions are important. They all provide us with information. They can become problematic though if they are too frequent, too intense, or they last too long in duration. So to backtrack a bit, what is an emotion? So emotions are little messengers. They provide us with a lot of information. So for example, I might feel happy if I have done something that I have found pleasure in, something that's been enjoyable. Otherwise, I might feel angry if I have perhaps spoken to somebody and they have done something that hurts me or something that goes against my values. So with that information, I can then go on to make a decision about what I might do in future. So if I've done something that's quite pleasurable, I might repeat that behaviour again, knowing that I will then experience another pleasurable emotion. Likewise, if I have felt angry by an interaction with somebody, then I might make a decision not to spend as much time with that person in the future because perhaps we have different values. So emotions are very important and we want to take them into consideration, but we don't want them to run the show as such. So in terms of the DBT, dialectical behaviour therapy model of the wise mind, we've got our emotional mind, which is where our emotions hang out. It's quite hot, it's mood dependent, and our emotions run the show. The other side is our reasonable mind, which is pretty logical, it's fact-based, it's cool, calm and collected, and it doesn't take our emotions into consideration. So even though this might sound like a pretty good place to hang out and make decisions, we are missing a very important piece of information, which is our emotions. So when we combine a bit of our a bit of our reasonable mind and a bit of our emotional mind, that's where we get our wise mind, which is taking fact, logic, and that reasonable decision-making process into consideration, but it's also acknowledging our emotions and our emotional state because, like I said, they are providing us with some very important information. So we don't want them to run the show as such because when they do, we can actually become quite distressed, because if I'm experiencing an emotion that I have judged as being bad or unpleasant, what happens is I want to get rid of it. But in saying that, I don't want to get rid of these emotions as such because they do provide me with important information, like anxiety, for example. With anxiety, I need this particular emotion to keep me safe, because if I need to cross a busy road, for example, I might start to pay a bit more attention to what's going on around me. My senses are a little more heightened and I'm a little more hypervigilant. So that's going to keep me safe. But like I said, they can become problematic if they are too intense, too frequent and last too long in duration. So that's also the difference between somebody experiencing sadness and that chronic ongoing depression. So there can be a bit of a paradox when we want to get rid of these emotions that we perceive as being unpleasant or painful, because the more we try to get rid of something that we don't want, usually the more distressed we become. So for example, if I tell you, don't think of a white bear, don't think of a white bear, don't think of a white bear, probably you've all got a mental image of a white bear in your mind, because the more I try not to do something, often the more I am likely to do it. So for example, if I'm feeling anxious and I might be telling myself, don't be anxious, don't be anxious, I've got to get rid of this anxiety, then I might become anxious about the fact that I'm anxious. But then I could become upset about the fact that I'm anxious, and then maybe I get angry at myself about the fact that I'm upset, about the fact that I'm anxious, about the fact that I'm anxious. So as you can see, I've had this snowball of emotion, which is quickly turned into an avalanche. So even though we want to take our emotions into consideration, we want to allow ourselves to feel them and experience them, but we also want to contain them and make sure we do have skills to help with our emotional regulation. So to avoid experiencing more pain than necessary and being able to contain and regulate our emotions, we really want to allow ourselves to feel them. Even if we do perceive them as being painful or unpleasant and something that we want to get rid of. So we want to use some distress tolerance skills to help us through that. We don't just want to sit there and be suffering with that painful emotion. We want to remember that emotions are temporary states. So they're like waves in that they do peak in their intensity and then they subside. So we want to use some skills to help us to ride the wave of that emotion, knowing that it's not going to last forever. So we might use some distress tolerance skills like distraction. We might use some self-soothing. You could use some mindfulness or grounding skills. If you're struggling with a craving, you might do something like use some urge surfing skills. So you don't want to just sit there and be agonizing as you're trying to experience this emotion. You do want to use some skills to help you through it. But in the long term, in terms of minimizing the distress that we feel and reducing our vulnerability to some of these emotions that are a little more painful and are a little more unpleasant, we want to actually allow ourselves to feel them. We don't want to get rid of them. So to summarize, emotions, they're all important. They all give us a lot of information. They're little messengers, so we want to pay attention to them. There's no such thing as a good or bad emotion, but they can become problematic when they're too intense, too frequent, and they last too long in duration. So we want to remember that emotions are temporary states. They're not fixed states. And we want to allow ourselves to experience them and use some skills to help us through when we are experiencing emotions that we perceive as being a little more unpleasant or painful. But we do actually want to allow ourselves to feel them in order to minimize the distress that we feel in the long term. So you definitely want to use some skills to help you through that so we can learn how to ride the wave.